My name is Roland Paris, and on behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies, I want to welcome everyone here to this event on the Arab Spring 1 year later. We still have a couple of rows of seats up at the front that are pretty empty, so when people are arriving, if you can encourage them to kind of be bold and to walk up the sides and maybe plunk themselves down if we need the space, that would be great. It's really remarkable to consider that it's already been a year since Tunisia's President Ben Ali was driven from power on January 14th, 2011. And so very much it's just one of these rare moments when it's remarkable to be alive and to be interested in international affairs. So much has happened since then, obviously not only in Tunisia, but of course in Egypt and Libya and in virtually the entire Arab world. Changes that also quite clearly have immediate implications for the non-Arab countries of the region, including Iran and Turkey and Israel. And we thought at this 1 year mark that it would be useful and interesting to bring together a small group of experts on the region to take stock of developments over the past year and to look ahead as best we can at what might lie ahead. In fact, the idea for this event was suggested by Thomas Juneau, a strategic analyst in DND and a PhD student at Carleton, so I do want to publicly thank you for the suggestion. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce our three panelists. We don't have name tags, so I'll have to point to them. In the middle of the three is Omar Ashour. Can you put up your hand, Omar? There he is. He is a lecturer on the politics of the modern Arab world and director of the MA program in Middle East Studies at the University of Exeter. Currently, he's on a sabbatical year visiting at the Brookings Doha Centre. He is the author of The De-Radicalization of Jihadists, Transforming Armed Islamist Movements. And we've asked him, in his opening remarks, to say a few words about conditions in Egypt, and perhaps also to add some thoughts on a topic that he has done a lot of research on and is continuing to research, which is the role of political Islam in Egypt and perhaps maybe in the broader Arab world. Our second panelist is to my immediate right, Barak Barfi, research fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and a frequent commentator and blogger on Middle Eastern politics, including for The New Republic, Foreign Policy, and CNN. And for his opening remarks, we've asked him to say a few words about the situation in Libya. Our third panelist is my colleague at the far end of the table, Peter Jones from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa. He has experience in Middle Eastern security, and he's expertise and experience. In fact, he's both an expert and a practitioner of Track 2 diplomacy. And we've asked him to say a few words about Iran. Of course, we'll have plenty of time to discuss other issues and places, including the rapidly unfolding events in Syria. And after their initial remarks, I'll interview the panelists for a very brief time, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And finally, before we get underway, I'd just like to remind you or implore you to please turn off your cell phones. I'm going to do that right now for my own, actually. Would that be embarrassing? Turn off your cell phones or any other devices you have that might be noisemakers. So with that as the plan for our session, I'd now like to turn to our first panelist, Omar Ashour, to speak for 12 to 15 minutes about the situation in Egypt and perhaps also about the role of political Islam in the uprisings.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and I'm so glad to be back in Ottawa. I spent some 7 years or more here in Canada, in Montreal, doing my PhD, and I came more or less as a a de facto refugee, if you wish, coming from the, or escaping away from the political repression of the Mubarak regime in 2002. And when I came here, there was no way I would have imagined that I would return to Egypt without Mubarak or some of his, one of his sons or one of his entourage in the country. So more or less what happened is a miracle. And the question is, how did it happen and why did it happen, and what's up now? What's going on? What's going to happen in Egypt now? So the whys are pretty clear: the motivation, the social injustices, the political repression, the economic deprivation created the motivations. The revolution was more or less leaderless. It was you had organizational skills by activists, online activists, and then later on joined the organized forces, joined in, especially the Muslim Brothers at a later stage on the 28th of January, and other also Islamist groups who have quite a intact organizational structure. And then the critical matter came when the military establishment decided to pressure Mubarak to remove him. And to remove what they did not really want out of the status quo, which was the emerging group of private businessmen, tycoons associated with his son Gamal Mubarak. But the rest of the status quo really was not a priority for them to move. The how did it happen? As I mentioned, there was a bit of non-violent resistance, mass protests in Tahrir Square and elsewhere, but also there was a bit of violence, if you wish, that was targeting mainly the police stations and the central security camps, which are the internal army in Egypt, the 325,000 soldiers and officers that serve as riot police, if you wish, between quotations. And the 98 police stations that were burned and the attacks on the camps, I think that was tilted. They made the balance of terror, if you wish, or the balance of power tilt towards the revolution, coupled with the army taking the side of the revolutionaries. And then after that, we had a stage which was a bit different. We had a stage where the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces taking over the country. Revolutionaries were not in power. The revolutionaries is a very, very broad term. You had everybody under this title for a while. Islamist, leftists, political activists who became political during the revolution, and you had this code name Tahrirists, if you wish, people who were camping in Tahrir Square, regardless of their ideological and organizational affiliation. And those became the more or less four players in the Egyptian scenery now, post-February 11th, post-Mubarak. You had the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, more or less taking over the country. You had the Islamists who did not spark the revolution, but were very critical in its success. And many people will try to deny that, but on the 28th of January, there was a very high chance that this would be over, except for the intervention of the Muslim Brothers specifically, and other smaller organizations, Salafi-oriented and the Islamic group and others. And those have the capacity, as we saw in the elections, not to spark a revolution, but also to gather momentum and gather support because of their organizational skills and administrative skills and the 30 years of social services that they provided in the Egyptian society, the interaction with the students, the being present in the syndicates. Obviously, the revolution did not rescind all of that. So they were able to capitalize in the electoral process. So they are the second power. And then you have a third power, which is the Tahrirists, the mosaic of revolutionaries. Most of them are young. Most of them are very idealistic in their perceptions and very determined and very persistent in using Tahrir Square and other squares in Egypt as a tool to pressure the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to get concessions from them or ultimately, as we may see, or as the plan of some of them goes, on the 25th of January to topple the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Not likely to happen, but it will be an attempt. So the next 25th of January, there will be some serious action going on in Tahrir Square. And then the fourth power is the dormant power, what we call in Egypt the couch party, Hizb al-Kanaba. It's just people who are sitting there and watching. But those people, whoever attracted them on the 25th of January, last 25th of January, they were critical. They were the critical mass that switched things to a large degree to the side of the revolutionaries. And those there's a struggle to attract those now. On one hand, you have the SCAF, the Supreme Council, trying to attract them to his side by propaganda using state TV, using the media outlets, saying that they are the guarantors of security and safety of the country, and therefore they have to support him. And a couple of times they attempted to gather some of the couch party to another square, the Abbasiyya Square. So now it became Tahrir, wanting change versus Abbasiyya wanting status quo. Although the gatherings in Abbasiyya were relatively, they didn't exceed, I think, 5,000 persons at the best, so it was relatively small, so they weren't that successful. The Islamists are very interested also in attracting this crowd, and they actually were that successful in the elections, in more or less providing a mix of religious symbolism, safety and security rhetoric, coupled with upholding as much of the status quo as possible, because for that specific party, the concern is security number one, economy number one, and security number two. Sometimes they switch, and the Islamists played on that role, coupled with the symbolism factor. And then the Tahrirists, who are now not very successful in attracting the couch party, mainly because they have different priorities. For the Tahrirists, many of them want to see a quick democratic transition of the country. They still have the slogans of the dignity, the freedom, and the bread in their mind, and they want it as quickly as possible. They don't see the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces as providing any of that, and therefore they want to push for change. And the way to push for change is sit-ins, strikes, and more demonstrations in Tahrir, which with the couch party is quite different in that they are more or less sitting on the couch and watching what's happening, and the SCAF more or less being successful in telling the people, in telling this couch party, it is the Tahrirists that are ruining the situation. We have another issue now, the constitutional crafting that is going to happen with the parliament. For those who don't know, the parliamentary elections in Egypt yielded around two-third majority for Islamist parties. They are not ideologically even that similar. The big two schools are the Muslim Brothers schools, which is more political, more experienced, relatively pragmatic, and relatively moderate between quotations, accepted electoral democracy since the 1940s, participate in elections on one side, and you have the more socially conservative, ultra-conservative Salafi parties, which also yielded around more than 24-25% of the seats. So with the Muslim Brothers, they make around two-thirds. And those will obviously have a critical say in the parliament, in the constitutional crafting process. The parliament, the next parliament in Egypt, as opposed to Tunisia, is not that of a powerful mandate. What it has is it cannot appoint a government, it cannot sack a minister, it can question a minister. This is the best it can do in terms of the in terms of relations with the executive. But what it can do is to appoint or choose the General Assembly that is going to write the Constitution of Egypt. And the Islamists obviously would like to have an ultimate say in writing the Constitution. So the next battle, it will be between a military that wants to have specific articles that legitimate their intervention and legitimate their status, Islamists, some of them want a more socially conservative agenda and want that to be reflected in the constitution, especially the role of the Sharia, the role of the Islamic rulings in Egypt, or Islamic law in Egypt. And others, specifically members of the Muslim Brothers, who were more or less interested in fending off the military outside of politics and trying, because of their experience, trying to make the security sector more checked and more monitored so that they don't crack down on them at a later stage. So that will be the upcoming battle. Now there's a third, or I'm going to go back quickly to the Tahrirists, who a lot of them are youth, are younger members, young men and women, who are not, who are starting to form their own parties, starting to form their own organizations, still lacking experience, but definitely not lacking determinism. And many of those, you will ask them what do they expect for Egypt, and they will give you a long list of hurdles to the democratic transition and a long list of negative outcomes that could happen. But after that, you ask them, so what do you think? And they will tell you, frankly, we're going to repress depression. We're not yielding. We're going to stay here until this military goes back to its barracks and until Egypt gets its freedom. And it's that spirit that keeps them more or less going. Okay, I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to stop on Egypt now for a second and transfer to the Islamists elsewhere. Islamists, what you're going to see in the region is major, or you already saw, major transition in Islamist rhetoric and ideology, and sometimes behavior as well. They will, a little experience from Egypt, I interviewed many members of the Islamic group, which is a militant group that used to be an ally of Al-Qaeda at one point. And I talk a lot with the former head of the armed wing of the group, who authored this little piece back in the 90s that said, "Another God with Allah, ? Declaring war on the parliament," which basically it was an anti-democratic manifesto that was very popular among jihadi groups. And this same person did his PhD on on political pluralism in Islam, and now he's forming a coalition with another party in the parliament. So he actually entered the parliament and forming a coalition with other parties. So this was just the micro example to show you the amount of transition that is going to be going on. Like half of the MPs that were elected under Al-Nahda in Tunisia are female candidates, coming a long way from the Muslim Brothers in Kuwait, for example, who until 2005 forbade women's suffrage. Like the idea of voting was not acceptable for them. So you'll see a lot of changes in the rhetoric and in the behavior and in the ideology. The Libyan Islamists, the head of the military council of Tripoli now, was the head of at one point, or at a later stage, the head of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was a group that, again, that didn't believe in democracy and perceived the most effective way for social and political change was violence, was political violence. Now, the same guy, Hakim al-Hajj, I interviewed him again multiple times, the same person is calling for a civil democratic state and calling for calm, trying to control as much as possible his followers to not to mess things up in Tripoli, which is divided now between militias. So you will see some of this transition happening. The challenge is how much of this relatively experienced leadership that interacted, again, had Nahda has been in politics for a long time. Many of its leaders saw the exile, saw the prison, saw the interaction, attempted to form coalitions with the other, the ideological and the religious other, and so on. But their mid-ranks and their grassroots are not at the same level of maturity, not at the same level of experience. Same applies to Libya, same applies to Egypt. So how much this leadership will be able to influence its followers and control them, and then, or we will see another version which will be splintering and clashes between them and even polarization between them. I'll have to stop now because I finished my time, and happy to follow up when we get to the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many people in the room have questions to ask following from that presentation. Next, I'd like to ask Barak Barfi to offer his thoughts on the situation in Libya and any other issues he might want to raise in his 12 to 15 minutes of opening remarks.
Thank you, Roland. My first question would be in the Q&A, Omar speaking about Karam Zuhdi, is that the man in question from thank you. Ever since the revolution erupted in Libya, commentators have expressed worries that the political unrest would have vast security repercussions. Talks first centered on Libyan Islamists and their relationship with the greater jihadist community. Documents captured by the American military in Iraq, known as the Sinjar records, indicate that Libyans came to Iraq in great numbers as suicide bombers. A number of senior al-Qaeda officials in Pakistan heralded from Libya. Many were worried that jihadists would descend on Libya to help overthrow Muammar al-Gaddafi. Though Islamists are certainly strong in Libya, fears of turning Libya into an al-Qaeda haven have been largely unfounded. Today, policymakers are more concerned about the proliferation of his weapons in the region. The biggest risk stemming from the fall of Gaddafi is that his non-conventional weapons could fall into the terrorist or rogue states. The biggest problem, of course, would be the nuclear weapons. Libya delivered its last shipment of enriched uranium to Russia in 2009. It does, however, have uranium concentrate known as yellow cake. This yellow cake is being stored in the Tajura nuclear facility and also in Sebha, deep in the Libyan desert. There are about 2,000 tons of this yellow cake. These sites were never really secure. American diplomatic cables indicate that security was very lax at the Tajura facility. There are less worries with the smuggling of yellow cake than with more conventional weapons, because very advanced technological equipment would be needed to enrich this uranium. Only a small number of countries in the world would be potential customers of such a product, and the smugglers engaged in Libya would be hard-pressed to make contact with them. Another non-conventional weapon is chemical weapons, specifically mustard gas. Libya has about 11 tons of mustard gas, and they are sealed in large steel containers and bunkers, which means they're pretty safe. Weapon smuggling is also a problem, but it's really not a new phenomenon in Libya. Porous borders are a problem. Libya has hundreds of miles of easily traversable borders with its neighboring states, Algeria, Chad, and Egypt. Many tendentious sources have circulated unsubstantiated claims that weapons have flowed out of Libya into neighboring countries. But we do have proof from a number of places, such as Egypt. Also, organizations such as the United Nations have noted weapons have reached sub-Saharan African countries bordering Libya. American military officials such as AFRICOM head General Carter Ham and U.S. Representative Mike Rogers have also noted that surface-to-air missiles have been smuggled out of the country. Further proof is offered by falling arms prices in the region. According to an Algerian report, the price of a Kalashnikov has dropped from about $1,000 to about $560 recently. I also was able to find documents when the regime fell. Everybody flooded to the intelligence headquarters, and I was in Libya at the time, and I found a document that talked about smuggling of weapons across the Niger border. So these very porous borders also saw conveying of weapons, not only now, but also under Gaddafi. Many Algerian press outlets that support the government must be scrutinized, and very closely, and I caution the audience about the next detail. One report says the amount of weapons seized in the southern and eastern areas in Algeria is greater than the amount of weapons seized in the last 20 years. The biggest problem we're going to have about smuggling weapons is what are known as surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs is their abbreviation. They're also known as Strelas in Russian, or the American counterpart of Stinger missiles. These are shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missiles. It's quite light at about 31 pounds, and it's easily transferable. Since 1975, 40 civilian aircraft have been downed using these missiles, killing more than 800 people. In 2002, Al-Qaeda used SAM missiles to try to down an Israeli civilian airliner over Kenya. So we have seen some terrorist organizations try to get their hands on these weapons and use them. There are about 20,000 surface-to-air missiles in Libya before the war. A Libyan military official said in October that about 14,000 of these were destroyed or non-operable. That leaves about 5,000 left on the loose. However, a couple days later, a NATO official said about 10,000 were still unaccounted for. The United States has pledged about $40 million to collect these weapons, and there are about 36 specialists on the ground looking for them. They've also circulated thousands of pamphlets in Arabic, English, and French to neighboring countries so that border guards know what they're looking for. I'm happy to also say that Canada will give $10 million to Libya to help it try to secure its weapons arsenal. A number of senior American officials have said these weapons have left the country. The dilemmas with the SAMs, or the surface-to-air missiles, is that military men such as General Ham don't understand why they weren't used. They may not have been operable, they may have been missing peripheral equipment necessary to operate them. These are questions that will need to be answered to get a full understanding of the threat of these missiles. We turn to specific areas of weapons smuggling. We have to talk about a country that Omar spoke about, Egypt. Smugglers are profiting from the instability created by the Egyptian revolution. Tribes in Saloum on the Egyptian border traditionally smuggled consumer goods and cigarettes, but now they've graduated to more lucrative ventures. They're paying off border guards to look the other way. Deeper in Egypt, the security forces have captured a number of these types of missiles. They've thwarted at least 24 attempts to smuggle weapons. In August, the Egyptian military intercepted about 25 anti-aircraft missiles and about 9 shoulder launchers. Most of these weapons are going to Gaza. In Sinai, Bedouin smugglers say that the anti-aircraft guns, 14.5 millimeter, are readily available, as are the surface-to-air missiles that we've discussed. Israeli officials have seen these weapons in Gaza, and they're very worried about them. They're particularly troubling because they would allow Palestinian organizations to target Israeli civilian aircraft. Such a scenario would recalibrate the balance of power between Israel and the organization that's battling. Recently, news reports have surfaced indicating that Iran has acquired some of these SAM missiles from Libya and smuggled them to Sudan. Such reports cannot be confirmed, and it is not likely Iran needs these weapons for its arsenal. Organizations with sponsors, though, however, such as the Lebanese group Hezbollah and Hamas, however, would find these missiles very attractive. It's possible that Iran plans to transfer these weapons to these organizations through Sudan. And in the past, Sudan has been a transit point for Iranian weapons going to Hamas. A big concern is that the weapons from Libya's arsenals will reach Al-Qaeda's North African affiliate, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or known by its initials as AQIM. The mention of the word Al-Qaeda strikes fear in many, but AQIM is the poor stepsister of the franchise that has wreaked so much havoc in the world. It can in no way be mentioned in the same breath as its Arabian counterpart, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, known by its acronym AQAP. AQIM is better known for its ransoming of Western hostages than for its daring attacks. It is racked by internal feuds and rivalries. It suffers defections. It's been pushed out of central areas of its home country of Algeria, deep into the fringes of the desert, and even outside of Algeria into the countries bordering it, known as the Sahel states, because they abut the Saharan desert. In the countries of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, poorly trained and under-equipped armed forces struggle to contain the threat of AQIM. It is here that the greatest threat stemming from al-Qaddafi's fall will be felt from the standpoint of security and economics. Any type of sophisticated weapons that reach the organization will be a boon. AQIM would covet SAM missiles because they would allow them to attack helicopters that are used in operations against them. More conventional weapons such as 106mm anti-tank cannons and 14.4mm anti-aircraft guns that preponderate in Libya will be just as useful. And just to take us back, I spent about 6 months in Libya during the revolution, and I saw these weapons everywhere I went. People's houses that had Toyota Hiluxes 4x4 mounted with these weapons. I remember a friend in Tajura I visited after the fall of Tripoli. He had boxes and boxes of RPG heads and 14.4 bullets. I just visited a couple weeks ago Libya, and I went back to his house and I asked him where all his nice little toys went to, and he said he turned them over to the Libyan National Army, which is this burgeoning armed forces group that Libya is trying to create. However, he told me that a lot of other people have not been doing the same, and people are holding onto these weapons, hoping to turn a profit. In many cases, AQIM operatives are battle-tested and veterans. In some cases, have more battlefield experiences than the armed forces they face. This is certainly the case in eastern Algeria, where AQIM does not shy away from attacking the military head-on. More efficient al-Qaeda affiliates such as AQAP only recently felt confident enough to challenge the military head-on. Other weapons such as munitions, mines, and artillery shells would help the AQIM build better bombs. Just this last week saw an uptick in AQIM's capabilities. On Tuesday, the governor of the Elizi province near the Libyan border was kidnapped, the most senior Algerian official to be abducted by the organization. This is not the first time Elizi has been the site of illicit activity. In April, Algerian military personnel observed Libyan smugglers moving in the area. It remains to be seen whether the kidnapping is a harbinger of a stepped-up AQIM campaign or a one-time event. While the organization was brazenly kidnapping the governor, it was releasing statements demanding ransom for Western hostages. It holds a stark contrast in the group's objectives. The United States is certainly concerned about sophisticated weapons reaching AQIM. In September, it warned oil companies operating in North Africa of an al-Qaeda plot using SAM missiles to target their headquarters or planes. The last problem of Gaddafi's fall that really isn't touched upon in the media is how his downfall will affect the sub-Saharan African country neighboring more economically. In the 1980s, Gaddafi was a destabilizing force in Africa, supporting leaders and groups that backed an anti-Western agenda. But in the 1990s, he had a change of heart and began advocating a pan-African ideology that focused on uniting the continent and ending conflicts there. The shift stemmed from the support he received from the African nations during the sanctions that were imposed on Libya by the UN following the Lockerbie bombing. He was very frustrated with the type of support that the Arab League offered him. In contrast, in 1998, leaders from several African countries, including neighboring Niger, Mali, and Chad, violated UN sanctions to visit Tripoli. He repaid these countries very handsomely. In 2001, Libya agreed to supply Ghana with 30,000 barrels of oil per day. In 2008, Libya donated $1.4 million in livestock equipment to Mali. Around December 2009, it gave the Ghanaian Foreign Ministry a gift of $250,000. Libya also heavily invests in Africa. Between 1998 and 2003, it invested $4 billion in African countries and sponsored 138 projects in 26 countries. Gaddafi also opened his borders to migrant African workers. Numbers are hard to come by, but there's anywhere between 1 and 2 million migrant African workers in Libya before the revolution. They work in menial jobs such as garbage collectors and send home remittances. Gaddafi also helped mediate conflicts in Africa. He brokered talks in Darfur, mediated between Chad and Sudan, the border dispute between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and tried to resolve internal conflicts in the Central African Republic and Congo. One group Gaddafi has historically been associated with is the Tuaregs. Much like the Kurds, these groups are spread out over several countries in the Sahel, from Burkina Faso to Mali, moving across Algeria to Niger and Nigeria. These semi-nomadic people have been in conflict with governments in the region. As part of his Pan-African campaign, Gaddafi tried to mediate between the Tuaregs and their host governments. A number of the Tuaregs also joined to something he created called the Islamic Legion. These people were forced to leave their land because of droughts in the 1970s and 80s. Tuareg Gaddafi were now compelled to leave Libya following the fall of his regime. And reports indicate that thousands of them crossed into Mali and Niger in the weeks following his regime's collapse. Now that he's gone, his successors will not continue his Africa policies. They will no longer invest in the continent, nor will they want to lavish poorer countries with aid. Destitute countries such as Mali will be severely hard hit. Tuaregs who fled Libya from Mali and Niger will not find work there. They will be prey for smugglers who will want to use our Libyan connections. Others will be drawn into Tuareg conflicts within the region. Already there are reports that leaders of the separatist group, such as the North of Mali Tuareg movement, have sought to attract returnees to their ranks. Hundreds of thousands of Africans from countries such as Burkina Faso and Chad will now have to head home, or they will not be able to find work. Already by June, we had reports of 10,000 returned to Mali and 100,000 to Niger. Simmering conflicts will also continue to boil since Libyan mediators will not step in. In short, the removal of Gaddafi from power will have serious economic and political repercussions beyond the security risks many have focused on.
Thank you very much. Situation in Libya, and our third panelist is Peter Jones, who has the equally unenviable task of describing the situation in Iran in less than 15 minutes. Peter, but if anyone can do it, you can.
Thank you very much. Iran in 15 minutes. So, as was said, I'm going to talk about a country that is in fact not an Arab country. And you might think it's rather strange in a presentation on the Arab Spring to talk about this, but in fact, the Islamic Republic of Iran is much affected by and hopes to affect the Arab Spring. And so I think it's worth talking about Iran in this panel. In the very brief time I have, I'm going to make some comments around three large questions. First of all, what is the impact of the Arab Spring on Iran's position in the region, and how do the Iranians perhaps perceive that? Secondly, why no Persian Spring? Why hasn't this happened in Iran? And finally, because everybody likes to talk about it, a few comments about the nuclear program, which I'll try and relate back to the first 2 points. So first of all, how has Iran's position in the region been impacted by the Arab Spring? The Iranians have proclaimed this, not the Arab Spring, but the Islamic Awakening. That was the phrase that the supreme leader put forward and that he stuck to. And it's the idea that it's not just the Arab world, it's the entire Islamic world from Morocco to Indonesia is affected by this upsurge. And the point has been made that this is largely based upon and draws inspiration from the 1979 Iranian Revolution. I think there's a widespread recognition that that's not true. If these events in the Arab world draw any inspiration from anything that's happened in Iran, it's what happened after the elections of 2009 rather than the revolution of 1979. And I'll be happy to talk about why I think that in the Q&A, but I'll just move on to my next point. I think that if you had been the proverbial fly on the wall, or maybe more appropriately a sort of a fly on the carpet, in the centers of Iranian decision-making over the last year, I think you would have observed a range of emotions. First of all, I think you would have observed quite happiness, joy at what's been going on in the Arab world. Secondly, that would have perhaps translated towards optimism. Thirdly, some concern, and presently worry. I think that's the range of emotions that they've been going through in Iran. And why do I say that? Well, I think that the Iranians, they won't admit it, obviously, but I think that they now see themselves as potentially net losers from the Arab Spring. There's the obvious case of Syria, the loss or potential loss of Iran's only ally, and I use that word in brackets, in the Arab world, and a loss of the direct linkage or line to Hezbollah in Lebanon would be a significant change in Iran's position in the region, not least because Hezbollah forms a significant element in Iran's capability to deter Israel in their mind. Beyond that, the possible emergence of a series of genuinely popular regimes, if that's what happens, in several Arab countries, and the emergence of a more assertive Saudi Arabia and a more popular Turkey, are all things that are not generally good in terms of Iran's diplomatic position across the Middle East. And again, time doesn't permit me to go into that, but I'll be happy to talk about it more. A more fundamental issue, I think, is the question of Iran's attractiveness to the so-called mythical Arab street, if it does exist. And I think that this street has for many years been based on a sense that Iran's revolutionary government was dynamic in comparison to some of the Arab regimes, seemed to be somewhat young, seems to have elements of being a representative government about it, certainly much more democratic, at least until recently, than governments in Saudi Arabia and so on, and was willing to stand up to the US and Israel. And these were attractive things. But if regimes emerge across the Arab world, and again, if, would share some of these attributes, while Iran's regime continues to slide towards old age, overt repression, and authoritarianism, I don't think Iran will be a source of emulation for the Arab young. And so Iran's ability to influence the discourse in the region will suffer. And I think that's potentially more significant than many people realize. It will no longer be helpful for groups in the Arab world to receive support from Iran or Iran's favor. And even Hamas feels the need to, in the present environment, to say that it's reducing its ties to Iran and searching for friends in the Arab world. I was in Israel and Palestine about 10 days ago, and I spent a day in Ramallah and met the head of Hamas on the West Bank. And he was at great pains to say, you know, the only reason we had this relationship with Iran was because nobody else would talk to us. We were forced into it. Now, with the coming to power of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, these are the more natural groups for us to want to talk to. And we're marching back from this relationship with Iran. This doesn't mean, of course, that Iran will not explore options around the region and try to influence events in the region. Of course it will. And I'm certain that those elements of the Iranian regime that are charged with trying to influence events around the region have redoubled their efforts to take advantage of the chaos and confusion in the region and to develop new clients and so on. But I think the gains that they make will be limited, tactical, context-specific, and transitory. I think that the basis for any kind of a strategic relationship between Iran and any likely Arab regime which comes out of the Arab regime, or any Arab regime which survives the Arab Spring intact, is very difficult to see. So in this sense, I think events in the Arab world are likely going to promote or reinforce the generally cautious and opportunistic approach which Iran has taken to the region for many years now. Second question, why no Persian Spring? I think there are several elements to any answer. First of all, I think the Iranian people don't want a revolution. I think anyone who's been there several times over the past few years will know how deeply scarred Iranian society was by the revolution in 1979, how difficult it was, how painful it was, and certainly while there is a widespread desire for change, there is not a widespread desire for a revolution in Iran. There were people who came out in 2009, of course, and they were a very significant part of the population in the cities, but if you go out of the cities and across the countryside, I don't think that holds. It doesn't mean to say the regime is popular. It just means to say a violent revolution is not what anyone wants, or what most people want. Secondly, up to this point, the regime has been able to keep going economically and to prop up its main supporters. This will change quite dramatically if the current sanctions on its ability to sell oil really happen. And I think that may be a cause of all this recent bluster over closing the Strait of Hormuz and so on. There's a concern that that may be coming. And a final reason, among many, why I think there's been no Persian Spring is that the repression after the 2009 election was really quite effective. There is no organized opposition in Iran, and I've been there a few times since 2009. This doesn't mean that there isn't an opposition to the government, but that the conditions for any spontaneous groundswell of discontent to be turned into an effective challenge to the regime aren't there. As one of my Iranian friends told me, unfortunately, green has gone back to being a color. It's no longer a movement. The leaders of the green movement are in jail. They're under house arrest. They're not there anymore. And it's also evident that the Iranian authorities will fire on the crowd, unlike in Egypt. I think the Egyptian army fled the Mubarak regime once the writing was on the wall in order to try to maintain its position in a post-Mubarak Egypt. I refer to the Egyptian army as a ship which refused to go down with its captain. But the point is, there's no post-Islamic Iran for the Revolutionary Guard. It doesn't exist. And they will fire on the crowd if it comes to it. So my third point, and I'm trying to get through this as quickly as I can because I know we want to get to the Q&A, which is always the best part, is to relate all of this to the nuclear program. Well, bearing in mind the generally very poor record of the social sciences in making predictions, my conclusion is that the regime is likely to try to hold on to the nuclear program all the harder as a hedge against the uncertainty which presently exists in the region. So I think in many ways those in Iran who argue that the nuclear option should be maintained in some way, shape or form probably are strengthened in that argument right now as a result of the Arab Spring. The only game changer I can see in this, as I said a moment ago, is if sanctions on Iran selling its oil abroad can be made sufficiently far-reaching and tight, and it's not yet clear they will be, that they really hurt the regime. And by this I mean they hurt the ability of the system to pay off the organs of the state which keep it in power. Up to this point, sanctions have actually helped people such as the Revolutionary Guards, or at least in terms relative to the rest of the economy. If the regime can't sell its oil abroad, that will likely change. But even then, I think that the contours of a possible compromise on the nuclear issue don't include a complete suspension of enrichment activity and all other nuclear activity. I think that's too much of a red line for the regime to bear. And we tend to forget that in the lead up to the 2009 election, Mousavi and those who were campaigning for power against the current government also said that they would maintain the nuclear program. They'd be more willing to discuss it with the West, but they'd maintain it. I think that really is a red line for Iranian politics and society as a whole. But I think significant restrictions on enrichment and a set of very tough monitoring provisions may be the basis for a discussion. Imperfect though it may be, this strikes me as the way forward, short of an attack, which would have disastrous consequences on many levels. So I'll end it there. I've tried to race through as quickly as I could, so thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. As advertised, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll throw open the discussion for the questions from the audience. And I'll leave it to those in the audience who are interested to ask questions about the countries that we have not addressed yet in this discussion. Instead, I'm going to choose to drill down a little bit deeper in those 3 countries that we've been discussing. First question is really picking up where Peter left off. You said the social sciences have a pretty lousy track record for prediction. It gets a laugh not only the first time, but the second time, so it must be true. Bearing that in mind and not wanting to hold any of you 3 distinguished analysts to soothsaying, I'm going to ask you to make a little bit of prediction here in each of your countries, starting in the same order that of your opening remarks with Omar and Egypt. You mentioned that the emerging lines of tension and competition and battle, figuratively speaking, hopefully, over the role of the military in government, presumably connected to that, its role in the drafting of the Constitution, and also the place of Islamic law in the Constitution. How do you see that the tensions in the battle which you painted in your opening remarks, how do you see them playing out? That's going to be your question. For Barak, I'm going to ask the following question. How do you see Libya struggling through the challenge of demobilizing and reintegrating city and regional militias into not just a single national security structure, but into a single national polity? And then for Peter, maybe I could ask you just to talk about how you see this. You mentioned about what you anticipated could be the lines of some kind of settlement on the nuclear question or Iranian position, but could you talk about the tension, the current and mounting tensions between the United States and Iran, the United States offering, carrots, possibility of negotiations, but also putting down bold red lines. How do you see those tensions playing out? You want to get your phone? That's not you? Okay. All right, so that's okay. That's all right. It's not like the what was it in Baltimore, Philadelphia, or New York the other day? Somebody, where was it? New York, Philharmonic, first row, phone going off. Conductor stops, turns around, says, "I'll wait till you're done." Ooh, that was harsh. So anyway, no problem. On Egypt.
Okay, you basically asked me to predict the future.
Correct.
So
that's exactly what I asked.
I'll give scenarios, a good one and a bad one. I think the best scenario we can have is maintaining the institutional opposition to the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in the Parliament. So you will have pressures from the Parliament getting its act together, trying to put the limits to the military power and the military influence on the political process. Because the SCAF, I think, what it wants now, the minimum for its demands is legal and constitutional immunity for its leaders from anything that has to do with corruption or repression, to an independent economic empire that doesn't get taxed, that doesn't pay customs, has preferential exchange rates, has the right to confiscate any piece of land in Egypt and don't pay for it. The treasury gets nothing. So they want to keep that. That was the status quo during Mubarak. They want to keep that status quo. And 3, veto in anything that has to do with national security issues, high politics, sensitive foreign policy, so on and so forth, especially vis-a-vis Israel. So this is what they want, the 3 things they want, and that's the minimum. The maximum would be probably a weak presidency and a weak parliament, and then they can manipulate both against each other and hire the government and so on. So if the parliament gets its act together to challenge these demands and put the military back in the box, coupled with the uninstitutional opposition, the gathering large critical masses in Tahrir and elsewhere, other squares across Egypt. That will provide enough pressure, I think, on the military to put it back in the box and continue with the democratic transition. The critical issue in democratic transition is whether the elected civilians are controlling the military and the security forces, or the opposite is true. The security and the military are playing around with the elected politicians. So I think that will be the key. That's the best scenario for Egypt. The worst scenario is that you will have the SCAF will get what it wants. We'll get basically these three minimums at least. And you'll find an Islamist secular polarization that is playing on the issues of whether Egypt is a Muslim country or not, whether the Sharia should be implemented or not. And you'll find the military using that to undermine both the secularists and the Islamists, and basically telling them that they are inefficient government and inefficient parliament, and using that to enhance its influence. They don't really care whether it's a liberal Egypt or an Islamic Egypt that much, but mostly they're focused on their very much corporate interests. So this is the good scenario and the bad scenario.
Thank you, that's helpful, and I'm hoping for the good one. Now, Barak, on factionalism in Libya.
That's an excellent question. The big problem here is institutions. Libya really never had any state institutions. It never had them under the monarchy that rose from 1951 to 1969. And when Gaddafi came to power in 1969, he really destroyed the state institutions that he found. And he built what was called a Jamahiriya, state of the masses. And he wanted to remove the bureaucracy as a buffer between him and the people and talk to the people directly. So then he destroyed all the state institutions. As a result, Libya has no state institutions that it can fall back on. And when you look at a country like that Omar's talking about, Egypt, the big conflict is the military now. That we have a democratically elected government. It's time for the military to step aside. But it's such a powerful institution, such a powerful player in Egypt's domestic scene. Having ruled the country since 1952, it's not willing to give up the vested interest it has in the economy. We don't see that in Libya. We don't see any armed forces. There weren't any armed forces after the 1980s. The disastrous war with Chad and the multiple coup attempts. Gaddafi marginalized the military, and he demonized it. Revolutionary committees, which were akin to the Ba'ath Party in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, demonized the armed forces and their mouthpiece, Zahf al-Aqsa, the Green March. We also saw in the 1990s that Gaddafi never used the military to put down what Omar spoke about, Abdul Hakim al-Hajj, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They had an uprising in the 1990s. Gaddafi didn't really use the army to put it down. So we don't see even an institution of the army, which we see in many third world countries that don't have developed institutions. So that's the biggest problem we see going. Also, before I move on, what I'd like to say is Libya is not going to be Iraq. We're not going to see an insurgency in Libya. We don't see the same level of violence that we do in Iraq. I spent a lot of time in Iraq during the war. I spent a lot of time in countries such as Yemen, where we also see a threshold of violence that is a high threshold of violence. We don't see that in Libya. The tribes aren't violent to that extent. There's not that type of desire for bloodletting in Libya. So we're not going to see a type of insurgency that we saw in Iraq. Libyans also a very patient people. They're willing to give their government a lot of leeway that the Iraqis were not willing to give them. How do we move forward from this? Basically, we have the Libyan leaders in the NTC, the National Transitional Council, and the interim government. They basically need to strengthen themselves, and they have to win over public support. If they can deal with the economic problems, and that's basically what all the people's problems are. They frustrate, the people in Libya are frustrated, they'll invent a lot of problems. At the end of the day, they just want their monthly checks. Every Libyan gets about $300-400 a month from the government, and that's all they want. This money is frozen, about 160 billion of it is frozen, and they're not getting it. If the Libyan government can give the people the money, it'll really calm tensions between them and the government. And if they can win over the support of the people this way and increase transparency, they can really paint these militias in the corner that they're harming national Libyan interests. So Libya also, the NTC also has to implement the patronage networks that Gaddafi had that he established, mostly subsidies for housing and food and basic services. What the NTC needs to do is it needs to take these people who join the militias, and most of them join these militias because they didn't have jobs, not out of any patriotic feeling. And needs to give them vocational training. It needs to retrain these people. And Mustafa Abdul-Jalil, who is the NTC chairman, has talked about this at length. And to send these fighters abroad, to give them the training, so that they have some type of skills that they can implement in society. Also, maybe if you talk about the friction between the NTC and these regional militias, there's talk about devolving power to the regional councils, giving regional councils more of a say. We've seen this with devolving of the power when the NTC brought in members from Zintan and Misrata, who was the two largest militias in the November 22nd conflict, giving them the top security positions of the defense and the interior ministry. So we also saw that. And finally, the government can use a propaganda campaign after it's really established itself, implementing these patronage networks, really paint these militias as harming the state interests. And if they can do that, then they can really win over the people in society who are really worried about security.
Thank you. Peter, on the Iranian-American, and Israeli standoff.
Thank you. I think there are at least three elements to an answer to your question. First is, are the current set of activities that we see from the Americans and the Israelis and the international community, is it aimed at regime change or at changing the regime's behavior? If it's aimed at changing the regime's behavior, then I think that there is a way one can see to sort of negotiate a way back down from this. If it's aimed at regime change, then I don't see why the Iranian regime would go along. And I think at this moment in time, my sense is that that small group of people around the supreme leader perceive this more to be about regime change than changing their behavior. That's just a sense that I have. And that's obviously not good for the prospects of negotiation and so on. My impression is that the Obama administration genuinely is looking for ways to negotiate a way out of this. But I have an equal sense that there are many members of the US Congress and many people in Israel and other places who are really looking still at regime change as the ultimate objective of all this. So I think that conditions how this will play out. And particularly the need, I think, if we are going to have a negotiated solution, which I very much believe is in everyone's interests, to promote this idea that this is about changing behavior, not about regime change. Second point is the question of timing. And here, it's very interesting that on my most recent trip to Israel, I was there sort of a year ago, 6 months ago, and the sense that one had in talking with Israelis was, well, yes, the Iranian nuclear problem is a difficult problem, but we're working the issue, and there's Stuxnet, and this has happened, that, and the day when we'll have to make a fateful decision is sort of down the road somewhere. But this most recent trip, just a few days ago, the discussion was quite different. And it very much came down to an idea which has been put forward by the Israelis. And I noticed in today's Haaretz, Barak, Defense Minister Barak is saying, well, the day when we have to make a decision is again down the road. But at least for the past several months, they've been saying the problem we have is not so much when they'll be able to construct a nuclear weapon, it's when their program will go underground and therefore be immune from our attack. In other words, we can't stop it. And that may happen as close as 6 months from now. So very much the pressure to put this timeline pressure on, which to my mind was a tactic designed to make diplomacy ineffective and to up the pressure on the regime change front. If the Israelis are walking away from that, I think that's a good thing. But then thirdly, there's the question, well, if we are going to try and climb back from this and have a negotiated solution along the lines that I said, well, how do the countries involved climb back? How does that happen? And I'm somewhat dismayed to note that the resolutions on sanctions, which have just come through the Congress, they don't have an off switch. Obama has turned them on by signing it, but he can't turn them off once they're on. That can be done by Congress, and given the composition of Congress, it'll be difficult to do that. So if you're sitting in Iran and you're looking at, this perennial questions of carrots and sticks, which is a phrase, by the way, that drives them wild. They hate that phrase. They always, carrots and sticks are things you use on donkeys. We're not donkeys, we're a 5,000-year-old civilization. But nevertheless, we've got the sticks in place, but how do we turn them off? And how do you turn them into carrots? And until we can give, I think, a convincing answer that there is a negotiated outcome and that both sides are prepared, and that includes us in the West, are prepared to go down that path and make a certain number of compromises, it will be difficult to get going down that path. I think the conditions are there now with this potential set of sanctions on Iran's ability to sell its oil, which are, I think that's the only real sanction that will have a big impact on Iran. That there's a potential interest in coming to the table, but whether the diplomatic tools and the political tools are there to capitalize on that, I'm not so sure.
Thank you. And so there's nothing in that legislation that gives the President of the Administration the discretion to use on national security grounds to suspend the sanctions?
He can waive them for countries. He can waive the implementation of them for countries.
I see.
But once they're turned on, my understanding is it doesn't really rest with him to turn them off again.
Okay.
Which is very unusual.
Yeah. One last question for all three of you. I want to get your quick response to this. It's on the Iran issue, also picking up from the last speaker's remarks. The hypothetical scenario where Iran does acquire nuclear weapons. Much of the discussion, I don't know if you've been following the debate, there have been a lot of interesting articles on foreign affairs recently about, there was an article in the last issue, why, advocating a preemptive attack on Iran. And there have been a number of responses from Stephen Walt, a number of other people. It's very interesting exchanges, including David Frum has now weighed in. A lot of the argumentation for preemption is based on projections about likely Iranian behavior in the hypothetical scenario where Iran actually possesses nuclear weapons. And the presumption is that Iran would not be deterrable. I'd like to get you guys on this, and I want to give fair warning to our visitors that the Prime Minister of this country has actually weighed in on this too, where he said 2 days ago, he said in an interview, quote, about the Iranian regime, "These are people who have a particular fanatically religious worldview, and their statements imply to me no hesitation of using nuclear weapons if they see them achieving their religious or political purposes." Your thoughts? You want to go first?
Okay. Well, far be it from me to disagree with such a noted Middle East expert as first comment, if Iran does acquire nukes, I think that in my reading, in fact, you didn't know this, I'm writing a paper on could Iran be deterred.
Okay.
So, coming soon, hopefully, to a journal near you. Could they be deterred? And if they acquire the capability? I think the first point is, I'm not sure that they're out to acquire nuclear weapons. I see no evidence that they've made the decision to actually build nuclear weapons. I think they're out to acquire the capability to do so, should they need them. And I think in this, they are motivated largely by good old-fashioned realpolitik considerations. And I think we should never forget how deeply scarred Iran was by the Iran-Iraq war. And the lesson that they took from the fact that the chemical weapons were used against them and the rest of the world did nothing. In fact, the rest of the world tacitly helped Saddam Hussein to use chemical weapons against them. So they are determined never to be caught in that position again. And so my understanding over several years of looking very closely at it is that they're out to acquire the capability to build these things quickly should they need them. And it's sort of what is sometimes known as the Japan scenario, which suggests to me that their function is deterrence rather than using them against anyone else. Could they be deterred? Yeah, I know that there's lots of people saying that they're crazy, but there's also people like the commander of CENTCOM who said they're not crazy. I mean, if you look at their action, the bombastic rhetoric aside, if you look at the actions of the Iranian regime over many years with respect to questions of national survival and regime survival, they have tended to be conservative, risk-averse, and not seeking confrontation. So many other people, and if I may say so, those I think who know something about A, military force, and B, the Middle East, and Iran, think that the Iranians could be deterred if they did actually acquire these weapons. It wouldn't be a nice world to live in where we had to deter them, and certainly if I was an Israeli, I wouldn't want to live in a world of Iran having this capability. I understand that. But this idea that we're all going to wake up tomorrow and Tel Aviv will be a smoking ruin because some mullah had a vision, some Ayatollah had a vision, it really doesn't square with the reality of Iran. And I think it's a scare tactic that's used to try to get people to go down the path towards regime change, because of course, if they're the kinds of people who do this, the only answer is to change the regime. We can't have a deal with them. I think it's part and parcel of this is all about regime change, rather than this is all about trying to change their behavior. And so when people such as our dear leaders say these things, I think it plays into this very destructive and very negative diplomatic discourse, which we see from the Israeli right wing and the American right wing, which I think is really not helpful. But that's just my view.
I touched a nerve. You did. Thank you for that very eloquent response. Any thoughts on this, Barak or Omar?
I don't think I can say it as close, well as Peter put it. My expertise in Iran ends at the Safavid dynasty. That said, if we talk about Safavids and we talk about religion, people talk about how the Iranians use religious symbols all the time in their political language. Best example is the Karbala paradigm, I think what the anthropologist Michael Fisher talks about. Iran's leaders utilize the Karbala paradigm, which talks about martyrdom in Shia Islam, the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, in Karbala, I think 680, 681, for political ends. But they really know how to end the rhetoric and begin the rational realpolitik, as Peter said, from what we've seen in the past. I think the problem when we look at a region like the Middle East is we tend to see these dictators who are out of touch with their societies. This is the perception that there are these dictators that are out of touch with their societies, and they don't have to respond to their needs of societies. And the great example that everyone puts forward is Saddam Hussein and what he did to Iran. We really don't see a lot of that in a lot of the Arab countries. I think the only Arab country that comes remotely close to that was Hafez al-Assad, Syria, and to a lesser extent Libya, Gaddafi's Libya. But my point being here is that Saddam marched on his own path and he only listened to himself. A country like Iran is very, very complex, and there's a lot of puzzles and pieces in the mosaic. And what we've historically seen as the Islamic Republic, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, is it's always had to respond to public outcries and public perceptions of what's going on. So that's a very big problem here. How far will they take their society? Will they take them down the road to destruction, as Saddam Hussein did? And I think the answer, from the little that I know about Iran, is no, that it won't. However, I think the greater question here now is what's going to happen on the international scene. What we saw in the last few weeks of this talk about oil embargo is steps forward that we've really never seen, not only in Iran, but really in the greater outside of what happened in Iraq following the Gulf War, where the UN slapped them with an oil embargo. The ability of the Obama administration to really build this great coalition where everybody wants to clamp down on Iran's building of a nuclear weapon is really phenomenal. The example I look to is Libya in the mid-1990s. The United States tried to up the sanctions. There was a flight embargo imposed upon Libya in the mid-1990s. But what the Americans wanted to do, because it obviously wasn't working to convince Libya to turn over the two suspects in the Lockerbie case, it tried to pressure its European allies to impose an oil embargo. And when we look at Europe, it basically imports most of Libyan oil, and the biggest customers, Italy and Germany, balked, and I think Spain to a lesser extent. They wouldn't go on board with this. Whereas today, we're able to get countries like maybe China on board. And the oil embargo was phenomenal. I don't even think we'll even get to that level where we have to ask such questions.
Thank you very much. Omar, you want to jump in? Quick thoughts?
Just a very quick thought when it comes to the Islamic Republic. I don't think in the last, since 1979, the major decisions were not really influenced by ideology, but more or less by factional power struggle within the institutions, by the sometimes the leadership trying to looking domestically and working things out on the foreign front. But the ideology had very, very limited influence, and I think this will be applied as well in this nuclear crisis. Congratulations.
Thank you. for what it's worth, I appreciate your answering that question, sensitive one. For what it's worth, I think the suggestion that the Iranian regime is suicidal as a regime, there's no basis for that. And the suggestion that the Iranian regime would have no hesitation to use nuclear weapons is, at best, it's unfounded, and at worst, it's really provocative and irresponsible. Yeah.
Can I just make a very quick comment? An Iranian friend in Tehran once, we talked about this question of martyrdom and the Ayatollahs, as you say, they do use religious symbolism in their rhetoric. In reality, and he said, look, the Ayatollahs and the other individuals who run Iran, they do believe that martyrdom is a great honor. They believe it's such a great honor it should be reserved for other people. They have never shown any tendencies whatsoever to want to commit suicide for anything, let alone a belief. So.
Indeed, and as you said, Peter, it would be a very unfortunate situation if they did, in fact, develop nuclear weapons, and we should be bending over backwards to try and prevent that from happening. We have come to the time when we have actually a fair chunk of time left, about 17 minutes, for questions.